Hi everyone, today I'm going to show you using 4 different apps: Filmic Pro, Cinema P3 Pro Camera, the Moment Pro Camera app and Protake via their log profiles to see which one of these gives you the most dynamic range between the shadows and the highlights in your images for color correction and color grading process in post-production. I'll also be showing you real-world examples of which of these profiles are going to give you the most noise in your image as well. Let's get into it. So to keep this completely fair between each app, all the settings are going to be matched exactly the same. So as you can see from the shot in the top left, I'll be using 4K resolution, 24 frames per second, and doubling that into the shutter speed of 1/48. That way we can get that cinematic motion blur that you see in films. ISO will be kept at its lowest for each app, which will be at 33. That way we can get the nicest, cleanest image possible. Now with Filmic Pro and Cinema P3 Pro Camera app, they can capture log in 10-bit color. So ignore the colors because the colors are likely to be deeper and more rich in these apps, whereas Moment and Protake can only do log in 8-bit color. So ignore those, but do know as well that to keep this fair, I'll also be keeping the white balance at 5600 Kelvin, that's daylight value, and also I'll be using ND filters. So let's start off with the highlights and see what kind of detail we can retain from log to color corrected in the highlights. Now looking at Cinema P3 log, I have to say it does handle the highlights pretty well. The sun was right behind a very overcast day, so that clouds were pretty damn bright. And as you see when we zoom in, the P3 does hold some detail in that cloud, which is pretty impressive given the conditions I was filming in. Now I have to say when we move to Filmic Pro, it is a bit of a different story. With Filmic Pro, the highlights are completely blown out. There's virtually no detail whatsoever left from the log. Now remember, this isn't color corrected yet, so we'll see what the details are like in that, but when you go further into that shot, there's nothing there. With Protake, I have to say it does hold quite a bit of detail even above the building here, but it does grey out the image quite a lot, so it's going to be interesting to see how this works for color grading. Moving into the Moment app, and I have to say it's a very strange looking log. It doesn't particularly look that desaturated at all compared to the other apps, and I'm starting to wonder if this is any kind of proper log at all. Seeing them all together before they're color graded, you can see the highlight details differences between all of them, and it's quite shocking to see how different they all are. I thought they'd be quite similar, and probably on the face of it, Protake looks the weirdest out of all of them, I would say. Now color corrected, I have to say the highlights in Cinema P3 are okay. They're not amazing, but they're not awful either. When you see how it was before with the B log, you got more detail. Once you color corrected it, you lose some of that detail, but there's a little bit around the building on the bottom half. Now Filmic Pro, once it's color graded, the colors themselves are very good, very rich, but again, the highlights, you're just not keeping any of the detail on the clouds. And it was quite surprising as well, given, the app is subscription based now, so it's a lot more money than all the other apps. When it comes to color grading, the log in this particular weather conditions wasn't great. With Protake, there really was this weird sort of almost greyish hue to the image that I just couldn't get rid of no matter what I was doing. Adding more contrast seemed to get rid of a lot of it, but it was very hard to work with, and you can see the differences there, but still whilst you're keeping some detail, the image just looks perhaps slightly off. Now color corrected Moment shots looked really good actually, I have to say the color looks really nice, but when it comes to the highlights, you are keeping some of the detail but not all of it, and it just doesn't seem that different to me to a normal profile on Moment's app, so I'm not quite sure what the technical side behind this log is, but it doesn't seem to be giving you any more or any less detail than before. Seeing these color corrected side by side, you can see that there's highlight detail in P3, none in Filmic Pro, quite a lot but a bit of a weird hue to the Protake, and with Moment there's some detail left in the highlights, but there wasn't a huge change before. Now let's see what the RGB Parade tells us about the log profiles. So what is an RGB Parade? Well, if we look at the image here from Cinema P3 Pro Camera app, it's actually the B-log version, so this is for iPhone 12. And if we look at the RGB Parade here, it actually represents the reds, the greens, and the blues. So these colors make up all of the colors in your image. Now, the graph here at the bottom is where you don't want your shadows to be, so this is the darkest areas of your image. You do not want your R, G, or Bs, red, green, or blues, to be touching that line, because that means that you're getting pure blacks and losing the detail in the shadows. Same for the top, where it says 1023, you don't want your colours, your RGBs, to be touching that line, because it then means you're losing information in your highlights. So the bottom line represents the shadows, the top line represents the highlights, and if any of your colours are touching those, they're clipping, which means that you're losing detail. Now with Cinema P3 in log, you can see the highlights are just below clipping, so we're retaining some of that information. When I colour corrected, I just brought that down a little bit more, and we're able to keep even more of the information in the highlights. With Moment, the highlights are brought right down in their log format, very far down actually, so I didn't really have to alter that at all. In fact, I had to raise it a slight bit. Now in Protake, the highlights and log are brought right down to a very low level, so I actually had to raise them a lot to get a regular looking image. It's quite difficult to work with in the highlights, I have to say. In Filmic Pro, you can see we got clipping in the log profile, so I had to bring that down, but I still wasn't able to bring out any more information in the clouds from the log to color corrected, which is a bit of a shame. Now let's see what kind of details we can retain in the shadows with these smartphone filmmaking apps. As you can see in this image here with Cinema P3, the shadows are raised in the log profile. You're getting a bit more detail on the top left there. With Filmic Pro, they're raised even more, so you're actually capturing a lot more detail, which is quite impressive actually, I have to say, in the shadow details here. And with Moment, it raises a little bit, but again, it doesn't make a huge difference. And with Protake, it looks very similar to Moment actually, and the shadows are getting a bit more detail than if you hadn't used log. In a side-by-side comparison, you can see that Moment and Cinema P3 probably capture actually about a similar amount of detail, whereas Filmic Pro and Protake capture a lot more, particularly Filmic Pro, I would say. After color correction, they all look pretty good, but it's clear that Filmic Pro wins this one when it comes to the shadow detail, and it raises that shadow out of clipping, and it's something that gives you a much more fuller image. Now before the color correction, you can see in Cinema P3 the shadows are just above clipping, and then raising them a little bit to capture more detail, although we didn't capture as much as other filmmaking apps. With Filmic Pro, it's a similar level actually. The blues seem to raise a bit more, and I had to play around a little bit more to get them into a much more of a natural color profile when color correcting. With Protake, the shadows are just as raised as the highlights are lowered to a very high level, and then I had to bring them down slightly and contrast increase as well to get that looking good. With Moment, just like Protake, the shadows are really raised quite a lot, and it's quite difficult to actually get a normal looking image afterwards, but it does give you a little bit more detail. So let's take a look at the noise side of these apps when using the log profiles. With Cinema P3, you can see here at the fullest image when we're pulling out, it looks really nice and smooth. There's not much noise at all. When we get closer up, again, it's still not that much noise, and it's a very clean image. I was really impressed with Cinema P3 in this respect, and it does give you a very full image even after correction. With Filmic Pro, again, at this full pulled out aspect, it does look really nice and really smooth, not much noise, but when you go into it, you can see that actually whilst you're using log V3, there's a lot of noise. After color correction, there's not as much noise, anywhere near as much actually, but there is still some there lurking. Again, using the standard shot that I had, with Moment it looks very smooth, and then when we punch in, it still looks smooth, but then again, you're not getting that much of a different image afterwards anyway, so when we see this color graded, it really doesn't look that much different at all in the dark shadow areas, just the same as it didn't in the highlights. With Protake, when you're using a regular shot, it looks really good, really nice and really smooth, not much noise at all. When you go in much closer, you start to get a little bit of noise. It was handling the shadows pretty well, I would say, although there is some noise there, not as much as Filmic Pro, but there is some. And after color correction, you do get rid of a lot of that noise anyway when you add more contrast. So looking at these different shots from Moment, I have to say the difference between using log and just using the regular profile isn't actually that much at all. In fact, there's barely any difference once you color corrected it to just using a regular profile in any way, shape or form. So I really think the log profile Moment isn't really much of a log at all. So I probably wouldn't use that for color correction, color grading, that kind of thing. It's really not worth using the log profile Moment camera app. When it comes to Protake, that is much better, but there's this weird kind of gray feel to the image that was really hard to shake off. I really had to crank up the contrast in color correction to get rid of that, and it wasn't the nicest app to work with in terms of the post-production process. So whilst it does give you a nice image, it was a real pain in the butt to use. Now surprisingly, when it came to Filmic Pro, the shadows were actually really good. I was quite impressed, and whilst it did produce the most noise, you could hide that with a little bit more contrast. When it comes to the highlights, unfortunately, it really did seem to blow out the highlights more than any other app, and as a result you do lose a lot of the detail in the clouded skies like we saw in the shots I've shown you. When it comes to Cinema P3 in the shadows, you don't actually get as much detail as Filmic Pro, but I think it does look better in the shadows than the other apps. However, in the highlights, I think that's really where it comes into its own. You do keep a lot of the detail with Cinema P3 in the highlights, and really when you're exposing shots, that's what you're looking for, is the highlight detail. Are you blowing them out, or are you keeping that detail there? So given that exposure is so important to the highlights, and that's what you're exposed for, I'm gonna have to give the win in this video to Cinema P3 Pro camera app by a hair's breadth over Filmic Pro, and other apps I wouldn't worry too much about using those in the log version. If you enjoyed this video, then do check out my full beginner's tutorial on Cinema P3 Pro camera app right here, right now. I'll see you on the next one. Take care. Bye bye.